Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian in Washington, D.C., where we are at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, following the conclusion of a fascinating panel on the Arctic and America's role in it. And we're honored to have with us for a few minutes of his precious time retired Navy Admiral Gary Roughead, the former Chief of Naval Operations, who is now the Robert and Marion Oster Distinguished Military Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. And you're also an advisor here at CSIS. Sir, thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you very much. It's good to see you again, and it's great to be able to share some thoughts with you on an area and a region that I think is going to be hugely important to the nation's future.
Absolutely, and one of your distinctions when you were Chief of Naval Operations was to get work going on the Arctic Roadmap. And the predecessor to that was the Climate Task Force that you actually set up that led to the Arctic Roadmap. You've seen, obviously, the Arctic strategy was under development in the Obama administration, which was criticized after its 2013 pamphlet, and it morphed into something that is actually an actual strategic document that's been held up a little bit, but I know you're familiar with it. What are some of the most salient elements of this strategy that we're going to see here in a short amount of time?
Well, I think one of the things that we're going to see is that it's really expanded the thinking about the Arctic and the importance of the Arctic and how other countries are thinking about it, but more important than just thinking about it, what other countries are doing about it. And I'm hopeful that it will energize a discussion more broadly than just the Department of Defense about what the new administration should be thinking about in the context of an economic and security strategy for a region that is going to become much more important because of its transportation opportunities, its energy and resources that will open up, potential challenges to governance of that new ocean that is opening. But it also will stimulate a discussion about what we as a nation have to start doing if we want to be able to lead and protect our interests in the high north.
And from your perspective, what are some of the things that we as a nation have to do as somebody who has invested and participated in that intellectual process over the past decade or more?
Yeah. One, I think we have to look at how we're organized in dealing with the Arctic. The various departments within our government have equities, and how do we bring them together to have a more coherent strategy that ties together energy security, economics, and so I think we really have an opportunity now to look anew at what's happening. I think it's also important that we not become so preoccupied with a contentious debate on climate change that we lose sight of the fact that regardless of where people may be on the climate change issue, the fact of the matter is physically that entire space has changed. And what are the investments that we have to make? We need to understand that space more. We have to invest in the sensing capability. We have to invest in new communications capabilities. We have to invest in air and naval forces and technologies for ground forces that may need to operate there in the coming decades. If we don't start doing that now, we won't be ready when there potentially is much more competition in the Arctic than we're seeing today.
Obviously, I mean, one of the briefings, and Senator Dan Sullivan, the Republican from Alaska, Senate Armed Services Committee member, Commerce Committee, obviously somebody who's intimately familiar with the issues on the Arctic. You know, he spoke obviously also quite passionately about the importance for economic development and challenged President Obama's taking off the table, if you will, the Chukchi and Beaufort Seas. But more specifically, you know, one of the points that you made is that every time the interagency process has worked on it, it wasn't actually a genuine integrated plan. It was rather lines in the sea, as you put it. Right. Obviously, the United States Coast Guard is the maritime law enforcement, maritime, light blue force, if you will, whereas the Navy is the haze gray, navy blue side of things. What are the lines between the two services? What's the role, for example, in ice-hardened ships and capability in the Navy? Once upon a time, it existed there. It was the United States Navy and Coast Guard who were both innovators and in the icebreaker business, for example. How do you think Where does that line lie between these two important services in your mind, and what are capabilities that both need to build up?
Well, I think we need to look at the fact that both services will be operating up in the Arctic, in the high north. Clearly, to your point, the Coast Guard, in my view, is the service that will be on point because of its role in fisheries, search and rescue, and environmental enforcement and response. But we need to be able to bring both services together to begin to make wiser investments. To have commonality in potential ship design, or at least in some features that will be important operating up there. For example, you mentioned ice hardening. I think that as we go into the future, some of the ship classes that we should build with ice hardening features. Those ships can always operate in more benign climates and operating environments, but if you design them for the equator, they're not going to be able to operate up north. I think it's also an opportunity for us to look at international cooperation with our allies Canada and Norway and Finland, and how can we look at being able to shorten acquisition timelines, being able to take advantage of some of the icebreaking design technologies in Finland, for example. Clearly, we will want to build, and the American people will insist that our ships be built in the United States, and I'm 100% behind that. But if we can import designs, if we can bring in some of the technology, and then let our companies compete as well, I think we can really jumpstart things. And if we bring the Navy and the Coast Guard together and a common view of how we want to move forward in that regard, I think we can really accelerate our process.
And you also think that there should be leases, right? Get this capability into service as quickly as possible.
I think that we need to be able to have ice-breaking capability in the Arctic. Some would say that because the ice is diminishing, we don't need it anymore. My view is that we need it now more than before, because we'll have more activity, but those large ice masses that are breaking up are still moving around, and that's going to be the case for quite a while. So as we have more activity, we'll have more of a need to get up there to support that activity, to potentially respond to events or accidents that may happen, and we can't be on the timeline of a normal ship procurement, which is either going to be 12 to 14 years, which takes you to the early 2030s potentially. So what we could do is lease, for example, a finished breaker, learn from that, import the design, let our ship yard workers get on with building these ships, do it cooperatively with Canada, for example. And it's not just the icebreaker. For example, Canada is just about ready to begin operating an Arctic-capable patrol ship. Why should we not look at that design? And as I mentioned to someone from Canada, you build it up in Halifax, and we can build it in Bath, Maine. And we can jumpstart that whole development and design process.
Let me ask you, in part, you were saying about transiting in that region. You said almost the exact same thing that Admiral Papp said when the cruise ship was going through that northern passage. Those were days that nobody slept because, God forbid, something had happened, and you realize how thin the steel of any warships, much less cruise ships. What sort of an intellectual change has to happen in the United States Navy? Because the Navy historically has thought about the Arctic as a submarine terrain. ISEX is the big thing that happens every other year. Warships are not in those waters generally. GI-UK gap, for old timers, we know the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap from a submarine, any submarine warfare standpoint, but now folks are rekindling that sort of thinking. What's the sort of intellectual change that has to happen in the Navy, and how can the Navy help foster and drive this discussion forward, which has historically been just a Coast Guard issue?
Well, I think one of the things that the Navy can do is begin to look at that area as a future operating area, and to begin to do the science and the surveying that the Navy will need to operate there. Also, we really need to start sending some ships up there just to experience what it's like to operate. This is not new. There's a There's a category of when you cross the Arctic Circle, you become a blue nose in the Navy. Well, I can tell you that I have multiple blue nose certificates because I've been up there, I've operated up there. It's very different. And we have to start learning how to do that. And it's not just the Navy. We have to look at how do we conduct airplane operations up there. I think that the Arctic is the prime area where we should be really pushing hard for unmanned systems, because it can give us the information that we need and at the same time deal with those harsh environments. And I would also add the ground forces. Rather than a 2-week exercise, we should considering having people experience being up there for 4 or 5 months.
Let me ask you 2 quick questions. I know your time is brief, and you've been generous with us already. Russian military activity has dramatically been increasing in that region. How serious and how worrying is what Russia is doing, and what are some specific ways that we can counter that? Because obviously they can argue they have a tremendous coastline up there that is frozen for large chunks of the year. That explains why they have 40 icebreakers and nuclear icebreakers, whereas we only have 1 medium and 1 heavy icebreaker. But as you look at it as a senior military leader and military thinker, what are some of the specific challenges that Russia is confronting the United States and its allies with?
Well, I think what's happening is Russia is staking out its strategic space. Russia is protecting its interests in terms of the energy investment and resources it has up there. And what we have to be able to demonstrate is not just the ability to operate in the Arctic, but the facility to operate in the Arctic, and have it be part of what we do. And more importantly, how we as an Arctic operator do so cooperatively with other countries, whether it's Canada, Norway, Denmark, Finland, Sweden. And I would go so far as to say, begin to look at ways that we in ways can cooperate with Russia on certain areas within the Arctic. If we don't move into that space, if we don't learn to operate with facility and with effectiveness, we're essentially ceding that space.
Let me ask you now a Navy-specific question, last question. Obviously, the Navy's put its plan out for structure assessment of 355 ships. That was welcome news. Obviously, Ray Mabus focused intently, some would say too intently, on shipbuilding, perhaps at the expense of other things. You were CNO at a time of constrained resources where you did have to trade off some capability. You know, it was interesting that you mentioned that, somebody said about, operating in the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, and you're like, well, we haven't been doing that for a very long time because of trade-offs that we've had to make, obviously, in the focus in the Arabian Gulf, Horn of Africa, and in the Pacific. There's also a recognition by some that resources are going to be far tighter than we expect. I mean, there are some who expect a Reagan-like flow. Obviously, Senator McCain has put his plan out, which is remarkably generous and perhaps represents a high watermark. As a graybeard of Navy thinking, what are the choices you think that the Navy's going to have to make? Where do you think it has to make its tough calls if investment in the military is not as robust as people hope?
Yeah. Well, one of the things I think is, and I disagree, I think when you're a leader in the Navy, you have to be aggressive about shipbuilding because the Navy is about ships. And clearly, I think the past few years have shown us that we're stretched and that we need that capability. I think what the Navy will need to do is to really look innovatively at how it's going to build out that future force structure. And we talked a bit about some international cooperative efforts as a way of shortening time and cost if you want to be able to move more quickly through the design and development stage. So I think we have to be able to do that. I would also submit is that we need to look at having ships that can operate in the Arctic and in more comfortable climates.
Benign
environments. So we need to be able to do that, and maybe you'll spend a little bit more on the ship to have it operate in the high north, but you'll also have greater versatility so you can use that ship in more places. So I think those are some things that we need to do.
Go ahead.
And clearly, we have opportunities to take advantage of unmanned that really can extend the capabilities, for example, of an individual submarine, if it's networked with unmanned underwater vehicles, the long dwell unmanned aerial vehicles that we can use for surveillance and sensing and domain awareness, and we really need to move forward with that. We also have to keep an eye on what the operating costs will be and look at life cycle costs over the life of those various platforms. And then the big cost driver, as you know so well, is people. So how do we make sure that we're building a fleet where we optimize the great people that we have, but always have an eye on what it's going to cost to operate that Navy.
And last question to follow on to that would be, obviously the United States Navy has, there's a sense that shovel-ready projects, meaning littoral combat ship, which is a running line, is something that, let's double down on that. You were there at the inception, or right near the inception of that as a fleet commander, certainly when Vern Clark, your predecessor's predecessor was discussing that. Is that still the design you think that's the right design for the Navy, or does the Navy need, you were mentioning these ice-hardened ships, but is it time for a heavy frigate, as some people argue?
Well, I think that we have to look at that heavier frigate, but my view is we have a great capacity issue that we have to deal with. The running line of LCS addresses that capacity issue, and those ships, in my view, as the view I had when I was CNO, are that there are great places for those ships to operate. There are some places where you need something like a guided missile destroyer or something heavier. And so until we know where we're going, my view would be keep the lines hot, keep them running, make the incremental upgrades that you need, and given that you have something of value, you don't let go until you have a handhold on something else. And right now, one of my concerns would be that we'll jump to the next thing, and if the resources aren't there, then we only exacerbate the capacity problem that we have today.
Admiral Gary Roughead, former Chief of Naval Operations, David and Marion Oster, Distinguished Military Fellow at the Hoover Institution and with CSIS, sir. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks. Always a pleasure.